by starting this. I don't know if I can do justice to it well. I'll try. And because when I was working, trying to understand, I saw his works, but when I was preparing for this, I realized that there is a complexity about his practice, a complexity that uh, many have not actually captured yet. Right? A complexity not only in terms of a modern or a contemporary artist, but an artistic subject, right? How or what constitutes a particular artistic practice and how that artistic practice is related to the formation of an artistic subjectivity. And I'm emphasizing on this because located in Hyderabad, in the post-independence India, practicing contemporary art was a difficult task. It's a task and a choice that was very ambitious, right? And you have an artist here who started everything from scratch, right? So I'm not going to follow the biographical sort of a model here, but I would follow a sort of a conventional historical progression of his work, but try and understand how his thought changed, how his practice changed, and what motivated the practice to change, right? And also to understand how he, as an artist, shaped himself in relation to art practice. So it's not just him making art, but art also was making him. So it was that kind of a dialectical sort of a relationship. And we will try and see as we look at a few examples of uh, his paintings and sculptures, uh, what kind of personality, what kind of subjectivity that he kind of, embodied at different times. Subjectivity is not a fixed thing. So this is what I propose to kind of go with. Subjectivity has been a transforming entity. So you change as your art changes. So contemporary art, position and practice. So the position was not a fixed position. The position was a negotiating position. So he was negotiating with uh, economic context. He was negotiating with the institutions, right? He was not working as an isolated person, but he was also negotiating with his own ideas as well as institutions. So we will kind of begin with a few images, and then I would try and sort of make sense of what was happening with him. So we know that he studied in the JJ School of Art, right? He was good at drawing and painting, so his teacher at the school motivated him to go and study fine arts, right? So before going to JJ school, he actually did some exams. Like those days before the independence, artists, like aspiring artists, were attending the exams that were conducted by the Madras Art School and the JJ Art School. So they were like drawing higher, drawing grade 1, grade 2, those things. And he was very good at it. And then he enters the art school, and this is a year before he graduated from the art school that he did this portrait. And this was the time when the principal of the JJ School of Art really introduced new ways of painting, right? So he introduced the modern methods of painting to the JJ School of Art. Charles Gerard was the principal. And he really kind of inspired artists, inspired students, and he saw P.T. Reddy having a very promising potential. So he encouraged him to kind of practice in that sort of a language. So when we look at his beginnings of the practice, one important thing to be noted is that he was not trained in an academic realism. the beginnings of his training happened in the post-impressionist mold. So that is something that which is important to note, because that continues to be with him in, in terms of referring to figures and forms. So it was not a naturalist eye, but it was a modernist eye that he, that was trained in the JJ school, and that eye was the basis. That training was the basis for his reference to nature, right? So that you can see here. It's very clearly the brushwork is post-impressionist brushwork. There is this sense of, there is an attempt to capture the inner psychological and emotional, index, which in a way we see beginning with the post-impressionist sort of a, approach to portrait painting. And we see things like, all these were his paintings. He was painting really obsessively those days. All kinds of experiments. There were two trajectories I'll show you, and this is something that comes very clearly from the post-impressionist methods of, or model of referencing and painting. This is Khan Bazaar, Bombay, and you can see the color palette and the rendering very much comes from the post-impressionist Fauvist sort of a color palette and approach to, it's a little dark, and approach to what they were seeing. So this was the method that Gerard introduced to the training in the JJ school. It's very dark. And treatment of oil with this sort of a liberty and freedom. So we understand that unlike people who were trained in the academic realism, the British academic realism, this very training offered a sense of liberty and freedom, right? So skill with liberty and freedom, right? And that forms a foundation for someone like P.T. Reddy. And you have later artists that we don't have to, like the progressives. So this is one trajectory of acquiring skill and artistic sensibility coming from the Western early modern art. This is another trajectory which comes from referring to the miniature paintings. So this, the modernist approach to painting with sensibilities that were so-called rooted within the idea of tradition, right? So this is the kind of combination that we see happens in Bombay. So you would see this also in the progressives. The modernist idiom of pictorial rendering with the so-called Indian or the so-called traditional sort of themes and ideas. So we can see here cattle shed very clearly, the figure and the detailing of the, for example, the garment. So we see that it's very much, even the perspective is very different. There is a kind of a referencing to perhaps to the Mughal sort of a perspective, which is different from this sort of a perspective, right? So this is the kind of formation that we see in his early years as he was being trained in the JJ School of Art. So I'm spending time on this to kind of make the base for ourselves, and this is this multi-trajectories, the multiple trajectories is something that constituted the practice of P.T. Reddy. And that we will see as we go along. This also, in a way, reminds us of miniature paintings. And this is a little different from that, which kind of brings us to brings to our mind the post-impressionist approaches. So this, and I've seen some of his other works in the museum, which I am not able to show you here, that he was very clearly also referred to Kandinsky, right? The kind of works that Kandinsky did before he started the abstract paintings, the post-impressionist Kandinsky. You see P.T. Reddy's treatment of oil and light and landscape very much comes from Kandinsky, right? So this and 39 is the year when he graduated from the art school, and these are those works that we have seen that he made during his student days, right? And fairly promising when we look at them, right? And another dimension we see emerging is the idea of young Turks, right? After 2 years of his passing out of the art school, 5 artists came together and put this up, the idea of the young Turks. And young Turks is an interesting sort of a phrase. In the early 20th century, you have a group of loosely associated intellectuals were fighting against the Ottoman Empire, right? The kind of activities of Ottoman Empire. So these people, these group of individuals who call themselves Young Turks in the year 1908, 10, around that time, who were actually contesting the Ottoman Empire, they were also intellectuals. They were doing all kinds of expressions. They were not artists as such, but they assumed an antagonist position to the Ottoman Empire. So that was interesting, where when we see P.T. Reddy adopting this phrase, Young Turks, it is to kind of reflect that, perhaps, right? To kind of, that is the kind of sentiment, right? That is a kind of political charge and rigor that he assumed for himself, right? To kind of, now, who is the antagonist here? I mean, perhaps the British, we don't know. And because in the 1942, he participates in the Quit India movement. He received a fellowship from the British government, and he leaves that fellowship and participates in the Quit India movement. And we know that early 40s was very charged up with the Quit India movement and the freedom struggle, right? So it was that environment where he kind of conceptualized or kind of adopted this idea of coming together. And this was the first group that happened in India. Before progressives, or before the Calcutta group that formed in 1943, 41 was the first group, and the very coinage was very exciting. And this we see P.T. Reddy in the 1941, right? So right after the art school, very young, mid-20s, and he was kind of leading a group, and it lived very short, like for about a year or so. And this is the cover of the catalog of the first exhibition, and this is called the Bombay Group of Contemporary Indian Artists. And if you look at the image in the black and white on the cover, and this is P.T. Reddy's image, painting, and very clearly the post-impressionist model study and the nude, very clearly we can see that. And this is 42. So there is a kind of a double straddle that we can see between the post-impressionist and the sort of miniature rendering. When we look at Rajput miniatures, particularly, you see the kind of color intensity, color depth within the very flat pigment, and you see the linear rendering of the figure here, right? Which is different from the rendering of the figure here, right? You don't have such a linear line. So this linearity very much comes from on the one hand, Ajanta, on the other hand, you have the miniatures. So this is the environment in which there is also this nationalist consciousness very much dominating the ideas of tradition, right? So the linear quality of line comes from there, and the modernist temperament, a modernist approach to composition in terms of a diagonal figure, and then you have a still life, very much, coming from the Western practices of the model study and the still life, right? And this was also the time I was thinking, looking at other works of similar kind. Probably he was also looking at someone called Modigliani. The stylization of his figures I don't have many, but you may find very much sort of reminds us of Modigliani. And this is a group of ladies. So this early, like up until early 40s, you see this sort of a language that has two trajectories meeting in his practice, very much coming from the miniature sort of rendering. Look at the eyes, look at the facial features, very clearly coming from the Rajput miniature rendering. And after 42, he kind of working in Bombay. He was working in Bombay in the film industry as an art director, and then he moved to Lahore from there, and it was quite a charged up time. And he worked in Lahore in different, again as an art director in film studios, as well as in the printing industry, printing studios as block maker. And he didn't quite paint for a long time. So this was the time, and that's very interesting. And the gap, you know, we think in terms of when we think about artistic career, we think in terms of continuity. But when we look at this artist, we have to think in terms of discontinuities also. So that is something. So the breaks within the continuity is part of the practice and part of his formation. So he kind of stops painting and he comes back to Hyderabad in 1947 after independence, and it was during partition. He left all the paintings that he carried with him and he worked in Lahore, and he couldn't carry them back, right? So he lost all those paintings. And he came to Hyderabad in 47 and he started again trying to practice, but he couldn't really continue practice. And he was struggling for survival, right? That is again beginning from the scratch. When he went to JJ, he went there with the help of a scholarship given by a Raj Bahadur, right? And he belonged to a peasant family, right? So he studied in Karimnagar and in Telugu medium. Then he moves to Bombay. So it was beginning, like he was the first generation university student. Then coming back to Hyderabad in 1947, he had to start everything from scratch. And that's when he met his wife, future wife. And he also got married. And I think that was a very interesting turn. Different from the progressive artists. Progressive artists did not give up art for life. So here you have an artist. He stopped working. Like you have Young Turks, you have, you know, that kind of a charge that we saw in the 40s, early 40s. Now you see in the 47, he stopped painting. It doesn't work, right? Now he tried to fill in or maybe make the foundation for his family, right? So he made the house, he kind of gathered the resources to put up a family. Then he starts working almost a decade later, only in the, mid-50s. Yeah, about 10 years later, mid-50s. In between, he started a furnishing firm, right? When he came back, he started a furnishing firm. Now he started doing chairs and tables and other kinds. Now that is an interesting sort of an endeavor, right? So you have an artist trained in the in painting particularly, and shifts to making furniture. And he established a firm with partnership with 3 other partners, and then he runs it. And it was not a very smooth ride in the beginning, and it's only about a decade later you see it kind of strikes off with some confidence. So it was in the 50s, mid-50s, he kind of comes back to making art with a long durée of 10 years. And we see something like this happening. So this is, I'm sure, and you can see it's where it is coming from. It is Ajanta, but at the same time, it is not entirely Ajanta. You see the figure drawing, the body gestures very much comes through of the nude studies that he would have done in the JJ school, right? So this again gives him a turn, and he, so again he begins where he stopped in a way, right? Uh, the combination of what we call Indian traditional art and the modern Western art, right? The post-impressionist sort of trajectory of practice. So you can see that happening here. And around the same time. So this gets consolidated into this sort of a language for himself, and this was not a personalized language yet. So you see, many of the artists at this point of time were really searching across India. Post-independence, early 50s, you see progressives, they were also kind of, particularly in the 50s, there was a question about, okay, you are painting in a very much like a Western painter, but what about our roots? What about, being an Indian, how are you going to paint? So this question about being an Indian and, reflecting your roots in the practice was faced by many artists in the 50s, right? In the 50s, many of the artists have actually encountered the Western painting firsthand. Many artists travel abroad. P.T. Reddy didn't at that point of time. Several artists didn't also, but the questions were very much shared, right? So how do you now practice? You can't do anymore like what Bengal school artists did, going back to, tradition and bringing back now. No, you have to do something else because it is an independent India. You have to think about the future, not the past. So the ideas about thinking towards the future and thinking about the future of Indian modern art, these artists were really kind of struggling to arrive at a language that would be both modern as well as Indian. Now, along with this, there was another question that they had to solve. You're also an individual artist, right? Unlike the Bengal school artists, if you know, there was no question of being an individual artist. You worked within the framework of the national, Swadeshi, whatever. But when we look at the 50s, it is the internationalism on the one hand, on the other hand, the national modern. You have to kind of negotiate with the ideas of the national identity as well as the individual artistic identity. So the triadic sort of a structure that many artists were, engaged in at that point of time. And you see P.T. Reddy also goes through this. And right, so there are, and another thing we need to look, like we notice in his work is that he works in multiple languages simultaneously. Like many artists at this point of time, he was searching. So you see that he tries to find a path where the path automatically splits into 2 or 3, right? So 57, and you see this is 57, right? Very clearly a post-impressionist sort of a still life, but at the same time you see a kind of a stylization. You look at the figures were drawn on the knowledge of model study, but at the same time the figures were also drawn on looking at the Indian sculpture, Indian temple sculpture perhaps, or largely Indian temple sculpture. As we can see, we don't have paintings showing figures like that. Ajanta to a certain extent, yes, but temple figure sculptures, right? So it's like showing a Tribhanga in 3 different angles. And he was someone who was very much interested in Picasso, and many artists in India at that point of time were really looked up to Picasso as a figure of inspiration, right? And he and many emulated very closely in terms of figuration, distortion, stylization, and something like what you see here. It's not very evident, but if you look closely, there is certain amount of reference to Picasso. If you look at the eyes and the bulging eyes, but they also come from the Jain miniature, right? If you have seen Jain miniature. So there is a combination of things that were happening here in terms of references, both the West as well as Indian. The flat background, which is very much something that you would see in the miniature paintings. So what we are trying to do in this is to try and figure out what kind of art practice that was happening, right? In terms of contemporary art. What was the characteristic of contemporary art, and what was its context in Hyderabad? It's important to emphasize Hyderabad because when we look at people like Souza, Raza, or Hussein, or the national artists, the artists that entered the so-called history of the modern and contemporary art, their access to internationalism was different than what was happening to artists in Hyderabad, right? Where you have an artist here who was balancing between, and this is very important, there's a kind of a balance between life and art, right? Like making your own life and making your own art. So he was not giving up life for art, or he was not giving up art entirely for setting up a house, setting up a family, right? There was a kind of a constant straddle, and this sort of a balance, you see, he continues to be in until the end of his life, right? And within this balance between the life and art, between these two poles, the conceptual aspect of art, then what is art? The ideas about art, the personal relationship with art is something that he was constantly kind of searching for, right? There is a search, and that search is very specific to his personality, right? And I will try and elaborate as we go along. What is this search for meaning, right? Searching for meaning in practice. And this searching for meaning in practice, he is very specific, and it has a characteristic that is combined of both secular and spiritual, right? This is not a modern artist of the early 20th century West who is like totally bohemian and going beyond and against the social values. But he's someone who is locating his practice within the social, within the familial, within the moral, right? So there are these grounds of morality, social, and family on which he's trying to kind of search something in art. So the search is in art, but experiences are within the moral, social, and the familial, right? And we see that here. You have a family, and you also see a shift here, if you can see, from the clear figurative delineation to figure sort of coming together. The body, the anatomy of the figure kind of blurring into the space outside, right? So there is a slight move or shift towards abstraction, right? The clarity that you had in the earlier image moves away, and he tries and experiments his hand in abstraction as well, right? So it's a huge leap, 1960. So in the 60s, particularly from late 50s to 60s, there was a dominance of abstract expressionism internationally, right? Internationally, America, through its CIA, I mean, it's established now, you can find it online. It was through the Rockefeller Foundation fellowships, through Ford Foundation fellowships. These were operating as institutions that were funding Indian artists and artists from other nations, post-colonial nations, where artists were going and spending time in New York. And what you have in New York at that point of time, abstract expressionism. So domination of abstract expressionism. And it was the time of Cold War, where America was projecting itself as the culturally sophisticated and culturally upper hand over the Soviet bloc. So abstract expressionism was something that was really kind of affecting every artist. And artists in India were negotiating with whether we should go with it or not, because abstract expressionism is American, right? How do you negotiate your Indian identity with that? So there was this thing where Indian artists in India take different routes, and we will see how he moves into. And this is entrance to cave, and it kind of reflects his move or his response to the abstract expressionism, right? But at the same time, he was not entirely confident in taking this route ahead, and he pauses. And this is how he works. He takes a leap and he pauses and comes back. Takes a leap and comes back. So he's someone, he doesn't move in one linear direction, but you see a dot moving in multiple directions. So this is the image that you can have. A dot moving in one line, you have one single line, but you have someone who moves in different directions and comes back. So, which is why there is a simultaneity of visual languages when we look at his practice from early to late. So this is, the Lord comes to me and gives me a flower. So there is this idea of the Lord, the God, right? But you don't know which God specifically. But there is this dependence on the spiritual higher authority, right? There is the spiritual other on whom he's kind of depending his being in a sense. And 62. So again, a clear delineation of figures, a very clear figurative kind of a work. And right after that, you have again so there is a parallel that is happening between moving between figurative and moving towards abstraction, a landscape. Okay. So we see that throughout 60s, he kind of engages with this mode of trying to be abstract, but also trying to kind of get back to the figurative, like this, and you see this, a portrait of his wife, a clear figure. So this kind of a oscillation that we see between these 2 points of representation and abstraction, and this is something that many artists at this point of time were really engaged in. They were really struggling to choose between abstraction and representation, because abstraction can immediately brand you as Western and not having any Indian roots, and representation can make you look outdated. You are not at par with the international. So there was this kind of a doubt. There was this kind of a precarity that the artists had to choose between these two, but they were also trying to kind of bring them together into their practice, like something like this, where it's very clearly cubist in one way, analytical cubist phase of Picasso, but he's kind of adding color to it. So he's trying to kind of move into all kinds of directions in terms of engaging with the ideas of abstraction. And while this was happening, he continued to work in the furnishing firm until that 67. This is 66, 67, and he held one-man shows from in the early 60s. So he was very, very vociferous in terms of his, very much active in terms of his art practice. And you see he's coming back again to representation. So he's not entirely kind of moving into abstraction. So this is this constitutes the artistic subjectivity. You don't have a clear, so the very self becomes the source of search. You're trying to kind of figure out the, the contours of yourself, the contours of your art practice. And this is a very interesting image. This is Clement Greenberg. And if you know Clement Greenberg, he was the art critic who sort of pioneered abstract expressionism. This is Clement Greenberg in the center, in the three-piece suit. He brought this exhibition to Lalit Kala, Delhi, 1967, called 2 Decades of American Painting. So 2 decades, 47 to 67, the heights of American expressionism. And this was a traveling show, and he was going across different places, different countries, and giving lectures and propagating the significance of abstract expressionism. And you can see P.T. Reddy standing there. He already by then, he was a member of the Lalit Kala Academy at that point of time, and this was happening in Rabindra Bhavan Lalit Kala Academy. And you see, he was in the middle of the discourse between national modern and the international modern, right? And he takes a leap again into something like this. It's clearly something that strongly reflects the abstract expressionist sort of a mode. This is not the modern abstraction of the Kandinsky or Mondrian or early 20th century early 20th century abstraction. This is the compositional logic very much reflects the American abstract expressionism, but when you look at how he titles, it's very clearly figurative, right? Politician at Mike. So, I mean, when he was taking the abstract route, he was actually not abstract. He was actually looking, in other words, scholars have articulated this as the post-colonial condition of contemporary art. And this constitutes the contemporary art. It's not imitating the West, right? It is not coming after the West. It is something that you're contextualizing. This needs to be theorized differently. You're contextualizing a language from your own responses to your surroundings, right? And he's someone, now if you look at his personality, you can very clearly kind of understand from his works where he was not a temperamental artist. He was a very regulated artist. Why I'm saying this? You see, it is called scribble. I mean, when you scribble, you don't think. But he regulates his scribbles also. And he's someone who regulates his passion, right? So when you look at this, which looks very abstract, even when you look at this, so it's fairly uniformed and regulated. And this explains a lot for us, right? Which explains about his artistic temperament and artistic personality, and also his subjectivity in terms of the emotional and the intellectual. So while this was happening, very interestingly, you also have something like this happening. This is in the 1969, responding to the split in Congress at that point of time. And this is a turn that you see in his work. And this was also the time for Telangana agitation, and many people were killed at that point of time. So this is a pattern, or this is a sort of a mechanism of visual representation that he arrives at by using multiple layers of images. So you have the figures, you have a chair, you have a woman sitting in the center symbolizing power or symbolizing the political power, and you have the two bulls knocking each other, right? So there are multiple things, and these work as texts, right? So each element is specific about its meaning, right? It is not about, there is no ambiguity in terms of meaning, right? Chair means something. The bulls mean something, the figures pulling the woman means something, right? So there is a specific inscription of meaning into each element, right? So this is something that he continues to practice into the 70s, where the visual language is constituted as if it is an inscription, right? An inscription of political meanings. Now, the politics, and I'm not getting into the politics of the artist, for him, as we see his works, politics is responding to the dominant political environment. So his consciousness about politics and his ideological position is limited to or configured by the kind of political environment, the state political environment. And this is Vulture, the man of power. As you can see, Vulture is very literal here, and then you can see a man which has killed the other man. So there are many examples like this. This is another example. Political carry-on. So this is decaying political carry-on, where you can see the one person killing the other person, the dying, the decaying flesh and all, over which you have the power is assumed by this so-called politician. So these are in a way illustrative in structure and a response to moon landing, right, with the same logic. So this sort of a pictorial configuration, this sort of a layered pictorial logic, each layer having a specific meaning, he continues to work with even when he turned to tantric themes, right? It is in the 70s he moves into tantric image making, but largely dominated by the images or the symbols of Shaivism or the symbols of Vaishnavism, right? And this is a Shaiva cult, and you can see the layering here. And many artists at this point of time turn to Tantrism, and tantric imagery offered a way out for artists to respond to the abstract expressionism. So tantric root, what is called neo-tantric art, enabled artists to create abstract painting, but having symbolic meanings that are rooted within the Indian tantric practices, right? So this is, he was very much interested in Nehru. This is Freedom at Midnight. Again, these paintings have the same semiotic structure of, meanings that are clearly laid out. And, the lover of peace and power. So power, the chair. For him, the chair symbolizes power, and the dove symbolizes peace, and you have Nehru. So there is no mystification about it. Yeah, so he uses a larger tantric structure, visual sort of a design or the diagrammatic structure, and within that diagrammatic structure he kind of plays with his own images. This is again Nehru with modern and village industries. You can see the wheels and you can see a plant from the center, and same. Several paintings he did in the 70s. This is his self-portrait within that tantric diagrammatic structure with the layering of text and images. So this is the kind of direction that he takes in the 70s, moving away from the figurative, but the figures enter into the structure of the tantric diagrams. So he's not entirely giving up the figure or something like this, where the figure occupies the space within the, or it gets reconfigured by the diagrammatic structure or something like this. And he continues to work into 80s, and then in the 90s he kind of turns to straightforward religious iconic images, and he made like over 90 Ganesha figure drawings of small size. This is 94, and I mean this again in a way completes the circle, perhaps, the search for the spiritual, right? Where the spiritual is not abstract, but there is a constant coming back to the concrete, where you have the concrete symbol or the image or the icon of the spiritual at his late age. So quickly we just look at a few of his sculptures. Parallelly, he was also making these sculptures very much referencing to the tantric imagery. So this particular quote that I got of him also kind of reflects that he doesn't identify himself with any school of thought. So there was a kind of shift from one point to the other, where there was a constant search for something, search for meaning. But as I would like to say that while it was search for meaning, it was also giving meaning to his works. So it's a kind of a circle that he was engaged in. Like if we look at those paintings that we saw of the 70s tantric images, while he was searching for meanings in his own works, he was trying to give specific meanings to them. So this is the kind of loop in a way that he was engaged in terms of his search for the spiritual. Now, when I say spiritual, it is not religious. The spiritual is that sort of an inner aesthetic, sort of a substantiation. These are huge, fairly large sculptures, and you can see they are very symmetric. They are very clearly linear in one sense. And he also did these, abstract, very much, the British school of sculpture, the seed or owl. Okay, quickly, last few drawings where these are very interesting to understand his urge for clarity, his interest in clarity. When we look at the works in the 70s, where those inscriptional, what I said, inscriptional works, here also you see the same tantric sort of a diagrammatic structure, but you see he is clearly inscribing each and every figure, but also who they are, right? Father, mother, and himself, and the names of their names, and he's kind of bringing them into one sort of a diagrammatic structure, right? It's sort of a the tree of life. I mean, you the tree of your lineage, but here the lineage is sort of is structured within the diagram of a tantric format. And it is not just only the figures or who they are, what they are, but also what they do, right? They are. So he says, we belong to Kisan, to the Kisan. So that is a root. So he was someone who was very self-aware, right? Rather very self-conscious, right? So he was not a temperamental artist. He was very self-conscious of what he was doing, and he was very regulated about his emotions and passions, particularly when we look at his works. This is what we understand it. This is what I propose, or I understand. The emotions and passions are very clearly regulated. And here in this family, himself, his wife, and his children, you also have the symbols of Vishnu, right? So the god very clearly is there, and this is a very Telugu god, right? This is very clearly the Tirupati Balaji sort of a god. So this makes it very clearly, something very specific. It's not, while it is within the Indian contemporary art, when we look at artists from Hyderabad, there is a specific sort of a, assumption, a specific place they assume in relation to what constitutes contemporary art in India. This is himself, what is he, and what all he can do apart from painting, all kinds of things that you see here. And you also have a swastik at the bottom and Om at the top. And these are his patrons. I'm showing these because the kind of format that you have here, done with the help of photographs, is not very different from this format, right? So he's at the center, and you have the 4 patrons that supported his, you can read the names over there, that supported his studies. So he's paying homage to them. And this format comes very much from the earlier traditional painting practices, something like Nathadwara, if you have seen. And this is young Turks, right in the center himself. And then you have the 4 other artists' friends, his classmates. So, and the point that I was making, the idea of being self-conscious, you can see he's self-conscious about his own position in relation to others. He's self-conscious about his emotions in relation to what he's expressing, right? He's self-conscious about his articulation of politics, right? So this constitutes the kind of multiplicity of his aesthetic subjectivity, right? There are multiple directions, right? And each has a specific articulation of his self-consciousness. I think I'll stop here. If you have any questions, we can discuss. Thank you very much. No, it doesn't happen throughout his career. You see that when he was young and all, he was affected by that Quit India movement. And you have this thing, Young Turks, it was quite fairly popular. And Young Turks as a phrase, even now it is fairly active. And you have a TV channel who Young Turks assume a radical position, right? So it stands for that antagonistic radical position against the power in place. So he kind of adopted that. I mean, this is my reading. We don't really have it anywhere, but he adopted it, responding to the idea of, Young Turks assuming a radical position in relation to power in place, right? And at that point of time, he was already, very much infected, I would say, by the political environment of the time. And Later, after independence, you don't quite see that happening. After 47, you see he was very much working towards making home, what we call home, and gathering resources for making that home, right? And a little later he comes back to art, and he was also, which I mean I didn't really talk about. He was someone who was, while he was shaping the institutions, he was also shaped by the institutions. He was part of many of the art organizations in Hyderabad, right? Almost all the art organizations in Hyderabad, where he was not only an artist but also an art administrator, right? He was part of Lalit Kala Academy, Delhi. So he was also straddling that in a way. But yeah, the spark of the Young Turks, I don't see that happening later. His response to the political environment in the 1969, that was a moment when there was a separate state agitation in Hyderabad and throughout Telangana, particularly focused in Hyderabad. He was responding to that as an artist, but most without really participating actively, but mostly as a viewer, as an artist spectator, responding to an event. Similarly, responding to the split in Congress and the later sort of political uncertainty, but uh, that's not like a civil war environment. That's not like a radical political revolutionary environment. No. Mm, mm, mm. Mm. Hmm. Hmm. No, it was actually, it was already set in the JJ school at that point of time. Yeah, so it is within that environment they were kind of responding in a particular way. I haven't found anything specific and different from, let us say, them responding to or disagreeing with the Bengal school on the one hand and the academic realism on the other hand. The academic realist training was already removed, or sidelined by, but sidelined like Dhurandhar kind of a work was sort of, there was an alternative, let us say, introduced by Gerard. Uh, so you already he was already kind of within that environment. It's not that there was something new that he was trying to sort of introduce. It's a reaction, and which is why you don't see that sustaining. At least the progressives, you see, they sustained for a few years. Yeah. At least I haven't come across anything. I should give this disclaimer. This is not a comprehensive presentation. This is just the beginning. This is just the preliminary kind of a presentation. So there will be a lot of gaps in this. There are a lot of gaps in this. This is an exercise to kind of display the gaps, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, he received recognition fairly early. Right, that's very interesting. He was responding to the market tendencies, but he was not only responding to the market tendencies, right? So that is what uh, now I should mention this that he built a museum for his own work. Yeah, there's a museum, and it has 22 rooms, and his works are displayed in terms of different series. So in Hyderabad, yeah. So uh, it's very interesting to see how an artist. So that's where I was repeating this idea of being self-conscious, where you have a museum of your own work. You're looking at that, regularly, often. So uh, you know, so he was responding to the market, but he was also responding to the artistic languages. So not only market. I haven't. I, I don't know, but it's a personality. How can there are artists who are like who don't care what happens to their work, and you have him like there's one or two works where if he is giving one work or selling one work to a museum or someone, he would make a duplicate of it, not a copy, but the composition will be similar, same composition, but you will have a little difference, but almost same, right? So, but why is he doing this? It is it is his own personality, and you have also someone like K. Sheshagiri Rao, whose archive I have studied, and I felt that he was also very self-conscious of being himself as an artist, right? Probably this is part of the the modernist artistic figure, the idea of the figure of an artist who is a subject of certain kind, right? A self that is different from the others, different from the social, right? Probably that works through in a way. So there is this an extra significance is there with me as an artist because I'm an artist. There is that sort of a you know uh, a slant of narcissism that you see many artists would have it, and they would exercise it in different ways. So that is, I would say that is part of that narcissistic slant that we inherited through modernism, modernist painting. Precisely, yeah. No, it's a response. So where you, what happens in the images of tantric practices and yantras particularly, and you can see KCS Panikar using those astrological drawings for his astrological diagrams for his practice from the 60s. I think it offered these artists a structure that appears abstract in itself. It doesn't have any sort of a representational elements, right? You have a flat abstract structure, right? But at the same time, it is something that is rooted in this land, that which is indigenous. So indigenous, as we know, was a dominant sort of a preoccupation in the 60s. Artists were looking at the other kind of indigenous practices, and you have a group of artists who took to tantric and yantric diagrams. And Ajit Mukherjee's book was published by then, in the by the early 60s. The tantric art and its conceptual whatever depth and all. So artists were accessing not only images but also referring to those. So it's also a conceptual engagement, right? So it is an alternative to the representational, because we see that throughout the 60s and into 70s there was a constant debate among the artists whether one should be abstract or one should be representational, right? And you see particularly the artists of group 1890, and if we look at their manifesto, they address this question of whether one should be abstract or representational. They said no, we don't have to be abstract, either abstract or representational. It can be both. It can have both the elements. So you have that also in the 70s, Geeta Kapoor responding to this idea of abstraction and representation in terms of West and Indian. So we don't have to get into this fight between India or West, or being Indian or Western. And she proposes to be ideological, and that's where you have the turn towards place for people happens. But when coming back to this question about, no, they were not trying to be spiritual. That is interesting. While you look at the tantric practices, they are deeply rooted in the spiritual beliefs and practices. When you look at the artists, they were taking the visual elements, not the entire structure. Because the visual very much looks similar, or at least something parallel to the geometric abstraction that you would see in the abstract expressionism, right? So you have an abstract art which has an international appeal, because they were also working with the internationalism in mind. But at the same time, this is something that is very much of the land, right? So you see Birende changing his work once he comes back from New York, right? So before that, he was really struggling what kind of work he should do. Yeah, Raza's is a different route, where he kind of starts with in the 60s sitting in Paris but yeah, all of them were actually responding or affected by the dominance of abstract expressionism in one way or the other. Yeah. No, it's not deliberate. I didn't get a hand on them. See, he published. Yes.
When you are talking about an artist of the scale and spirit, a crazy man loved his drawing. He did a large, not one, a large body of work.
There are like 40 drawings that he published.
You got everything.
No, I didn't get everything.
Yeah, but anyway, what I'm trying to say is that it is so disappointing.
I haven't also shown his still lives. Okay, I agree that no.
Ask you, what is predominantly that he has done, and that is missing in the row of presentation that we have done.
Right. I
He was an eroticist.
Yes, that was a slant. That was one of the trajectories that he had.
Why the major part of his expression is not shown today?
Yes.
So you could have at least mentioned about it.
His erotic drawings.
You are talking about Raja, you are talking about various other things which have no relevance to what we think they is.
No, I was trying to contextualize his practice within the larger environment of contemporary art.
मेरा मेरा सवाल वो था और वो सवाल बिल्कुल राइट है and yeah, I think you should have and you have missed it and you have even said you missed it.
Yes, I missed it because I kind of slipped it from my mind. But I couldn't accommodate many. I mean, it's already 1 hour. There are lot of drawings, but I couldn't, and also to find them to show. Mm. There was this.
And you know the second painting which we show, the Bombay Street, that is actually is not the original work of people. It is a copy. The original was in the School of Art. We do not know where this is. That street is a copy. It is not the original work at all. There is no spirit. There is nothing in that painting to represent the characteristics of then the Baroda, then the Bombay, then the Delhi. It is so flat. I really cannot believe how could you include that.
That work is in the museum.
It's not, no, but see, look, you are a researcher. You are not an ordinary man. You are somebody who knows, who want to know, who want to tell your audience good things. One gentleman has asked a question, in fact we have not completed the question. EPAD sold 10 very beautiful works to a German. In fact, those are the works which are sold to National Gallery of Mexico. And he was asked him to send those works. PPAD refused to give the originals. We have employed some of our local artists to copy them and send those works.
To the German collector.
These are very interesting aspects of this personality. Expresses the whole thing. What kind of a person he was, how his art developed, what has happened, how many things have happened. So these are, see, what you spoke, I felt is not full of salt and water. He was a crazy person. He was a very interesting man. He was very excited. He never cared for what is happening around him. You talked about contemporary situation. What was the contemporary situation? Does he know the meaning of contemporary art? Art in Hyderabad in Narayan Street? Nothing. Nothing. He just went on his own way. And those are the areas which I think eventually reflect in the works which an artist produces. And that part of it was missing through your.
Yeah, I'm sure it is missing. I'm sure it is missing. It's just the beginning, and I have to. If I have to continue this, I have to really.
And he's your local artist about whom you should do more studies.
Yes, that's the spirit.
More inquiry.
Yes. Thank you very much for.
It is not so easy to follow
Yes.
a person like you.
No, it is definitely not easy. That's what I submitted in the beginning. It's a complex case, and I don't think I can do justice within a few, few slides and within an hour. It needs, yeah.
I'm anxious, I really want to know from your point of view of what you have done to bring me back alive, to paint who died. An artist you like, of course, not anyone is you, I know, you know it. So, we know how he painted, how he wore his booty. And early in the morning, go at 6 o'clock, he's reading, and the children are his painting. And he's talking to servants also at the same time. He's doing everything in the very same time. And he's not bothered about family and all that. He has no fear. He's one girl. You're not the thought. You're a good man. But you have to struggle so much to create the degree of trust on which you found place, he purchased it, he built up his system, he made it well carried, and both together again. And she was a Telugu language professor. She wrote to Oxford University. And she has contributed, I must say, we spoke about her at all. And I'm sure that is very important for the audience.
Very much. I think when I asked the question that if this artist was making duplicates, I mean, I was motivated.
No, there's nothing wrong.
No, nothing wrong, but I want to know that he was an eccentric.
No, but I wanted him to know it was not just for painting. Yes, the entire collection acquired by
That's a whole different personality.
and some of the artists have painted it. I know the names of those artists. I know those artists who have copied those paintings. Two artists still lives, one portrait, and one very interesting Krishna Happy Singha, somebody sitting in the chair, typical Indian, typical. I mean, all the time there was a lot of debate. People talking about what is Indianness in India, especially with the emergence of Bhagavad, with the emergence of writers like Gita. They say that a woman carrying a pot of water on her head is not an Indian thing. Then there were young guys like they are, then what is Indian thing? तुम लोगों को हुसैन इंडियन आर्टिस्ट नहीं है, राजा इंडियन आर्टिस्ट नहीं है, कोई भी इंडियन और तुम लोगों को एक नया लैंग्वेज तुमने पैदा किया, उसका मीनिंग इंडियन आर्ट का के वर्ड्स विल नॉट एक्सप्लेन the character and the origins of Indianness are the indigenousness. It is not the words of English. अगर अमेरिकन राइटर्स को इतना गैलेंस ऑफ इंक देकर they are commissioned to create new language and art, that does not make me realize that I need to understand creativity as Indian artist or is an art. That's all. So, in fact, we have been misled. Actually, other things are said, which are nothing.
You get the rational and the emotional part of it.
Thank you very much. I will take these inputs and try and better my work. Thank you very much.